Hi again, everyone, and welcome to Lecture 7. Today what we're going to do is we'll look at the short story, The Handsomest Drowned Man in the World by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and then I'll send you a second lecture. It'll be much shorter, and it will simply be, I'd almost call it like a workshop. I'm going to send you some templates, and I'll talk about the templates. And I think for this lecture as well, I'm going to send you my file on Gabriel Garcia Marquez. As a matter of fact, you already have it. The only reason I'm doing that is because there are a couple of names that I'm going to mention throughout, and rather than me spelling them out and explaining them or what have you, you'll be able to look them up if you want. Okay, so that's the only reason for that. Now, because I've sent you the file on Marquez, I'm not going to give you too much biographical information. All right, but there's one thing that I do want to make clear. So let's just start with his dates. 1927 to 2014. Okay, he died in Mexico City in 2014. He's one of the great writers of the 20th century. For those of you who are English majors, you should check out a book called 100 Years of Solitude. It's an amazing, amazing novel. It's one of my favorites of all time. All right? But anyway, as I said, because I've sent you the notes, I don't have to give you the whole background on. He was a reporter and he traveled a lot and all of that. All right? He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1982, and I've given you the other works there. So I've given you the main stuff anyway. All right. Now, here's the one thing that I want to make very clear if you're writing on Marquez. Okay, Marquez is maybe the favorite on the course for writing purposes. So be careful of one thing. Let's think back to what I was talking about when we looked at analyzing literature. All right. And I said to you, the one thing you don't want to do is go to the library database and type in the author name and then the theme that you want to work through. Because remember I said you'll be swayed by other people's opinions, right? Well, the same is true here, especially for one term in particular. There is a term called magic realism, all right? Page 2. So please do not write on magic realism for your paper. Post-colonial studies would tell us that is a culturally biased and imposed term that we give to certain writers, right, which don't fit what we in North American society would consider mainstream, right? So in other words, the idea of magic realism is a term that is used by individuals who didn't really experience the world that Marquez would have grown up in. Okay, so all I'm saying, let's just not confuse the issue. Please do not write on magic realism for your essay. There's 1,000 other things we can do, which I'm going to show you. So the purpose of this lecture, as was true with Paul's case and with the yellow wallpaper, I'm just going to give you some ideas. Ideas to think about, how would we get through an essay on this, okay, on this paper. And the themes are really interesting in this one, okay? So let's just look at a couple of things right now, all right? All right, the story is published in 1968. Unlike other stories that we've looked at, the date for this one I don't think really matters because there's almost like a universal theme that is running through, okay, this short story in particular. So, because you have the notes that I've given you, okay, let's just take a look now on page 2 at some of the main themes. One of the main themes that we have here is the notion of the land as being fixed and the sea, and here's the worst joke of the term, and the sea as being fluid. Okay, for those of you, no? All right, anyway, all right. But the idea is that at the beginning of the story, we're looking at stagnation, right? I mean, I could read it out to you, right? Like, we'll get to it in just a second. But the idea is that the town, the people are stagnant, all right? They're fixed, set in their ways, right? Obvious, right? But like I said, we're gonna dig deeper and we're gonna look at exactly what's going on in just a moment. So we start with that. And then we have the sea, okay? And the mention of the sea is everywhere in the story, obviously, right? Well, then that becomes something that is more fluid, right? In flux, okay? The possibility of change, transformation. Those are the key words. Do you see what I'm doing here? The notion of transformation. Okay, all right. Now, in your notes, I've also got this notion of a very interesting blending of religious and pagan beliefs as well. Okay, although I don't really like the word pagan in the way I'm using it, but I think you'll see what I mean as we get into the story. And then, as I said, once I've gone through the story, we'll elaborate on that when we get to the outline workshop template. Okay, like the templates that I'm going to send you as well in the second part of the lecture. Okay, now the other one that I thought I might talk about, because some of you I know you've emailed me and you're interested in Greek mythology. The notion of memory and forgetting is also a very interesting one. All right. So as I said, I'm not going to explain all of the information there. Okay. The whole notion of Uranus, I should say, who was the Titan god. I'm not going to get into all of that, but I will talk about this notion of memory and the notion of history. Okay, when we get to the end of the story. So, as I said, I might just skip over that, but for those of you who are interested and you want to work through something, feel free to email me, right? We can always discuss that as well. Okay, I just want to keep it simple for a first year course, all right? Okay, so let's get into the story. At the very beginning of the story, I'm going to grab the actual short story now. Marquez sets up the story by saying the first children who saw the dark and slinky bulge approaching through the sea let them think it was an enemy ship. Okay, so this sets up, I think, a major theme throughout the story. Okay, the children, okay, obviously still very young. They're not set in their ways. They are open to the possibility, okay, of change, of transformation. They are open to the possibility of their imagination. Okay, notice the language, right? Okay, let themselves think it was. So they're open to possibility. Now, what I would argue is there's not enough information, I don't think, in the story to actually focus on the children. But I think what Marquez is doing, he's setting up the relationship between, right, the children who are open to possibility and the adults who seem to be fixed or set in their ways. So think what I said earlier, right? The land is fixed. Also then, the adults are fixed as well. Fixed as in set in their ways. It can't be any more obvious than that. All right? Okay, so basically then, right? I'm on my notes now, on page 3 of my notes, but also on the first page of the story. The men who carried him to the nearest house, so I'm in the second paragraph now, noticed that he weighed more than any dead man they had ever known. Okay, so let's get into the significance behind this whole idea of the weight, okay, of the dead man, right? Obviously, right? He becomes a burden. Key word, right? He becomes the dead man, okay? We'll talk about his name and everything in a moment. He becomes a burden, right? A weight, if you will, okay, to the men of the town. So what I would argue is probably the best focus point that you can take for an essay on this story would be the men. Because you see, the women in this story, while they may be a bit fixed as well, they come to realize the importance of the dead man, all right? And again, I'm going to elaborate on that, but I'm going to keep it simple for now. So they understand the importance very quickly. Whereas for the men, it's a much larger arc. So the only reason why I suggest then you may want to talk about the men is that creates an arc for your paper as well, right? You always want to think about that. In other words, if you, again, let's go back just for a second. If you started with the children, you don't really have anywhere to go because the children aren't really mentioned after the opening pages, right? But the men, well, they take longer to get to where they need to be. And I'll explain, or at least argue, why they need to be where they are and all of that. So my suggestion would be focus on the men. Okay, it's just a suggestion, but that's what I would do if I was writing a paper on this story. So, okay, what I'm going to say now, okay, this whole idea of the men, okay, on page 351, okay, notice about the, I don't know, Just the idea at the bottom, right? I'll give you an obvious quote that you probably will use in your paper, right? That the village was made up of only 21 wooden houses that had stone courtyards with no flowers, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so that's all I mean by this whole idea of stagnation. All right. Okay. So now, okay, and it's a relatively short story, but there's a lot packed into it. And so basically, okay, we are told, right, or at least this idea that the men, I'm going to go back to the men now, the men feel weighted down, okay, by this outside influence, this outside force. So again, if you're making notes, the notion of something coming from the outside into this stagnated village is very important. All right. By the way, if I'm going to get into some religious ideas in just a second. So those of you who are wondering, like, is this kind of like a Christ-like story and all that? Sure, of course it is, right? But there's other things that I think are important as well that are well pre-Columbian anyway. Okay, Marquez was born in Colombia, all right, in a small town called Aratica. Again, you've got all that in your notes, so I figured I don't want to waste your time on that. All right, okay, so basically, as I said, this thing that comes from outside becomes a kind of burden, right? The men feel weighted down by this burden that has been introduced into their lives. They don't want any kind of change. Okay, I'm going to say something here, and it may sound odd because you have it in your notes, but then let me elaborate on exactly what we mean. The men have forgotten, okay, their collective past. Now, what in the world do I mean by that? Okay? You could make an argument that the men need to understand their lives, their history, in a different way. So, on the subject of history, there is a writer named Michel Foucault. Okay, you've got the last name there, Foucault, and first name is Michel. Okay, and I have an article for you on CU Learn entitled Nietzsche, Genealogy, History. Okay, it was published in 1984. And I've given you the page numbers that you need. So let me just read out to you a couple of things and then I'll just elaborate. So again, remember, I'm not going through the entire story and telling you, look at this line and all of that. I'm giving you ideas for a paper. And this is a great one. It's a great one. So, in the first little quote there, I say the historians, I don't, but quoting from Foucault, the historian's history finds its support outside of time and pretends to base its judgments on an apocalyptic objectivity. All he means by that is there was a time where a historian, if you took a history course, the idea was the historian was somehow above the society, was outside of the society, was objective. And of course, that's not true. We know that today. My goodness, with everything that is going on in the world right now, we know damn well that's not true, right? Okay, but there was a time where, in fact, that's the way history was taught, right? And so Foucault challenges this notion of history being objective. All right. As I said, there's no way I could get away with saying something like that. Oh yeah, history is objective. Oh yeah, the historian is objective. Bullshit. All right. Good. All right. We know where I'm going on that. So, well, if history then isn't objective, the question becomes, how does it become effective? So remember, these are Foucault's words, not mine, although I totally agree with them. All right? History becomes effective. I'm trying to connect this now to what the men need to understand about their own lives. History becomes effective. Okay? History, of course, is your life, right? Like when I'm talking about history now, I'm not talking about just history as the past. I'm talking about the thing that lets you understand who you are in the present. Right? Okay? Just to be clear. All right? So, and again, that's exactly what's happening in the world right now, right? This whole notion of understanding history, right? Well, much of what we think we know needs to be rethought, okay? I'll try and keep it objective, but I think you know what I mean. Okay, so history becomes effective, according to Foucault. Now, think about this for a moment, okay? I'm going to make some connections here for the essay, okay, for your essay. To the degree that it introduces discontinuity into our very being, right? The men are set in their ways. They're comfortable in, shall we say, their ignorance. Right? They don't want to be disturbed. The body is introduced all of a sudden. Now they feel a burden, the weight of the body. Okay? Right? In other words, it's disruptive. What Foucault is saying is that's a really good thing. It is good, basically, to have discontinuity, right? Continuity being the notion of an objective narrative, right? Your life as being simply a clear linear narrative. Foucault is saying, no, it's good to introduce discontinuity, okay, into that narrative, to make you think, to make you reevaluate. That's exactly what's going on in this story, right? And so, let me just jump a tiny bit here. Effective history deprives the self of a reassuring stability by a voiceless obstinacy towards a millennial ending. That's more or less what I just said, right? This idea that we think, there's a clear pattern, everything is laid out, right? But of course, that's not life, right? And so this whole idea then, discontinuity. There are many, many writers who've talked on this. For those of you who are English majors, John Keats talks about this with the negative capability. All right, if you've ever come across that, living in, discrepancy, living in ambiguities, right? In other words, the world is not as clear as we think it is, right? And so understanding that allows us to basically understand ourselves a lot better. At least that's what Foucault is saying. And so, let me explain maybe my favorite quote of all of Foucault, all right? This is because knowledge is not made for understanding, it is made for cutting. What Foucault means by that is basically if you spend $100,000 on a university career and everything that you are told already agrees with your point of view, then did you really learn anything? Right? No. The idea is to be challenged, to rethink, to reformulate. Okay? Not to say that you're wrong, but to basically challenge yourself and work it through. Many of us have opinions about things that we haven't really worked through. Okay? Like we pick them up from friends, family, what have you. That's what Foucault was talking about. Okay? Those of you who know a bit of philosophy, Soren Kierkegaard talked about that as well. If you've ever heard of the theory, or the phrase, I should say, the leap of faith, right? That's exactly what Kierkegaard is talking about as well. Okay? So, and I'm not going to get into it, but if you do know Kierkegaard, you know exactly what I'm talking about. All right. And so this notion then, if all the information, if everything you're given at university is something you already knew, well then that was kind of a waste of money, wasn't it? But if you're challenged and then you really start to reevaluate and think about your ideas, okay, well, if you still have those same ideas when you come out on the other side, that's really what Kierkegaard is talking about. Well, then great. But quite often we will maybe reevaluate, as I said, we might reevaluate some of the views that we once held. All right. So that's really what Foucault is saying there. Oh, and so let me get back then to the connection with the story. So again, let's think about it. Set in our ways, right? And then the whole notion of being challenged by an outside influence. That's very important in the story, by the way. And then coming to some kind of new realization. Okay, so there's your arc. And again, when we do the workshop in the second part today, like in the second lecture that I'm going to send, you'll see what I mean, right? I'm going to start really in a really basic way, and then I'll take it and become very sophisticated. Okay, so here's the last thing. I've been holding off on using this word until now. Effective history then deals with events in terms of their most unique characteristics. So something that doesn't seem to fit with everything else. Okay, then we have to reevaluate. There's a difference if you think about it. These are my own words now, but the difference between traditional history and archaeology, right? History will tell a narrative, tells a story of the way things unfolded, right? Which is untrue, right, for the most part, right? Very, very biased. Archaeology will come along and uncover things and all of a sudden upset the narrative that we thought was true. I love that kind of distinction between the two. For those of you, again, if you're into Canadian literature, Michael Ondaatje deals with this quite often in many of his works as well. All right? I know I decided not to shave when I did this lecture, but anyway, who cares? All right. And so, notice what he's saying here, just to be clear. An event, okay, is not a decision or a treaty, okay, a reign or a battle. So, in other words, at one time, that's what history was all about, right? This is what we call history from the top down, the history of kings and queens, right? Instead, what Foucault is saying is, well, no, actually, there's a different way of looking at history, what we call from the bottom up, right? And so, what he's saying, and I'll just get to the end of the quote here, okay? This whole notion, right, that I'm going back now to the word effective history, right? Remember what I said earlier about the men need to understand their collective past, well, their history, in a different way. And so, if you think about it, well, Foucault is arguing that in order to, and this goes against much of Western thinking, okay? I'm going to say it and then I'll elaborate. What Foucault is arguing is, in order for us to understand ourselves, we actually need, I'm quoting now, the entry of a masked other. Okay, notice I've got it bolded. So page 88 refers to Nietzsche genealogy history that you have on reserve, right? So you know exactly where to go to get it. So this notion of the other, and again, it's a term that's thrown around a lot. I'm not going to elaborate on it. If you read Foucault, you'll see what he means by that. But something outside. Ironically, in order to understand ourselves, what Foucault is arguing is we need something outside of ourselves, right, to again make us think, grow, and evolve. Otherwise, again, I think it's pretty straightforward. Otherwise, we remain stagnant. That's his argument. Now, this is not something that we will readily accept in the West, okay? Because we have been taught different things. Our whole culture, like I know that's a huge generalization, but when you think of media, advertising, almost all of our culture centers around the individual, right? That I make my own choices. I define my reality. That's simply not true. I'm sorry, it's not. But that's what we've been convinced of. And so, what Foucault is talking about is this idea that in order to, as I said, in order to grow, okay, we need something outside of ourselves to allow that growth to occur. Okay? Transformation. That's the word I keep going back to. Because you see, if you think about it, I'm going to get into something that is similar in a second, the imagination. Well, what is the imagination? What is imagination? Imagination, when used in a certain context, means possibility, doesn't it? Is it when we imagine, right? We think of something that might be. So possibility. Well, think about it. The next thing I'm going to talk about then, right, is, or at least for now, so the man, okay, I still haven't named him yet. I will because that's important as well. The man, right, becomes that other, which allows then for possibility to occur. Possibility meaning change and transformation. Okay? Fluid. So, going back now to just 10 seconds ago, all right? We are told, okay, I'm going to go back to the actual story now. As I said, very, very short, okay? But packed with a lot of stuff. Now we focus on the women on page 352. And I'll just read a couple of things quickly, then I'll go back to the notes, all right? I think that's probably the best way to do it for this story. The women are cleaning, okay, the man, okay? I still haven't named him. As they were doing that, they noticed that the vegetation on him, I'm in the second paragraph, okay, that the vegetation on him came from faraway oceans and deep water, okay? So, again, this notion of far away, possibility, okay? Something beyond themselves. That's really the key at the beginning. This idea they need to move beyond their specific situation, okay? Okay, their present situation, they need to move beyond that. Now, when I say they need to move beyond, I mean psychologically. Okay? All right. And so, there we go. But only when they finished cleaning him off did they become aware of the kind of man that he was, and it left them breathless. Now, just notice, okay? I'm not going to read the whole thing, but even though they were looking at him, there was no room for him in their imagination. So the word imagination, it pops up throughout. Okay? But like I said, the women are probably not the best focal point only because they come to the realization of the importance of this individual very quickly. It's like I said, it's the men who take longer, and that's the only reason I'm suggesting again, better arc for your paper. They thought, okay, that if that magnificent man had lived in their village, his house would have the widest doors, the highest ceilings, and the strongest floor. Okay, so now they're almost allowing him into their imaginations. Finally, okay, so now I'm going to go back again to my notes. All right, just want to make sure I'm not messing everything up here. So on page 353, okay, and now I'll talk a bit about that as well. We are told that he has the face of someone called Esteban. So, if you didn't look it up, and don't worry if you didn't, the character, the name Esteban, translates to Stephen in English. And Saint Stephen, okay, for those of you who maybe have a religious background, Saint Stephen is considered to be the first Christian martyr, okay, the very first. And it was through his, not only his faith, his teachings, okay, and then his martyrdom, that he actually, and again, you've got all the notes there, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. But the idea was that it was through his faith and his martyrdom that created a whole transformation and rebirth of Christianity. So there's another possibility as well when it comes to an essay, all right? Because, let me just go back to the story now. After midnight, the whistling of the wind died down, and the sun, okay, and the sea fell into its Wednesday drowsiness. The silence put an end to any last doubts. He was Esteban. Now, if you have a Christian background, of course, Wednesday, Lent, okay, some of you maybe as children remember Pancake Tuesday, right, all that. So Lent then being a time of fasting, okay, a time of repenting, a time of sacrifice, right? Because that's a word I'm going to use at the very end of the story. So a time of sacrifice. You're supposed to give up something for Lent, okay? Those of you who are familiar with the whole concept. And so the idea here that there's religious significance throughout. So as I said, let's make it obvious now. Christ, okay, in the Christ story, well, Christ is someone who comes from like a place that we don't really understand or know, right? And comes to a world that is in trouble, saves that world, and then returns from where he came. Well, that's exactly this story, is it not? Like and again, I'm giving you another essay topic, but that is this story, right? Well, in fact, it's a very common story, and it's not just a Christian story at all. All right. In fact, okay, there is a Colombian story. Okay, remember Marquez is from Colombia, and so that's why I'm sending you the notes. I'm not going to bother spelling it out for you, but I'm on page 5 now. There is a Colombian story that is almost identical to the Christ story, and it's excuse me, it's an individual called Quetzalcoatl. And if you ever go to the Mayan ruins or Mayan Riviera or whatever, and go down to places like Chichen Itza, maybe, or Tulum, right? You will see images of Quetzalcoatl. He was also known as the feathered serpent, and you'll see images of Quetzalcoatl like in all of the ruins, almost all of the ruins. All right. So again, you have the notes. So as I said, I don't want to take an hour talking about this story. I just want to give you ideas. So you could talk about the idea of the Christ myth, but you could also talk about Quetzalcoatl, who also arrived from the sea, okay, and then actually introduced, oh, sorry, off the top of my head, it's in the notes, but he actually introduced many things to the Aztecs, the Mayans, Mexicans, and he showed them how to take the cocoa bean and turn it into chocolate, right? But there were other things that Quetzalcoatl did as well, and he actually, the myth goes, all right, the story goes, that he showed the villagers, okay, the individuals that he came into contact with, not to do sacrifice as they once knew it, but instead to self-sacrifice, okay? Again, isn't that interesting that it connects back to the notion of land? You give up something. Okay, that's what I mean by self-sacrifice, right? Like giving up something, giving up something of yourself. Okay, so again, now this is really complicated stuff, I know, but we're like I'm looking for a more sophisticated second paper, obviously. So think about it. Well, giving up something of yourself. Could I make a connection back then to the notion of the other? Okay, that we were just talking about earlier. If I allow something to be introduced into my life, right? Well, in a sense, I'm kind of giving up. I'm becoming vulnerable. Maybe that's the best way of looking at it. And that's kind of what's going on in this story. Now, again, don't feel as though you have to talk about Quetzalcoatl and Christ and then Foucault and all of that. No, take one aspect, work it through. We've been through that already, all right? But anyway, and so it's interesting, though, because now I want to show you something. I want to show you something that I think will help you for the arc of your paper. Take a look at the bottom of 353, okay? And so, as I said, we've talked about Esteban, St. Stephen, Wednesday, Lent, right? The first day of Lent is always on Wednesday, right? Okay, 40 days before Easter and all of that. And so, yeah. And so notice at the bottom of 353, okay? That was what the women were thinking beside the body, okay? A little before dawn. Later when they covered his face, okay? Okay, when they covered his face with a handkerchief. Okay, I'm going to talk quite a bit about that in just a second. Another great idea. So that the light would not bother him. He looked so forever dead, so defenseless. And then notice, so much like their men. So, a perfect quote, right? To use in a paper. You see now what I'm talking about with the notion of an arc, right? How we can move through an essay. That's the kind of quote you want. So, something has to happen to the men, and I'm going to show you exactly one way of doing it. Something has to happen to the men in order for them to finally see. If you've taken any English courses, I mean, this notion of seeing, right? I always go back to, of course, Oedipus, right? And I'm going to talk about Oedipus more when we get to the Rocking Horse Winter, okay? But this notion of Oedipus the king, if you've never, Oedipus sometimes it's referred to, but the idea that in the story Oedipus the king, yeah, it's an amazing drama. The idea that Oedipus, if you've never studied it, I'm not going to get into the whole thing, but the character is blind, quote, like blind throughout the whole drama, until finally he plucks out his eyes, and for the first time he actually sees the reality of his situation. All right. I'm going to talk about that more. If you don't know what the heck I'm talking about, don't worry, because we still have lots of time before the final paper. And it doesn't really apply in the same way for this story, but it certainly applies for the Rocking Horse Winter. Okay? All right. Anyway, so the idea, though, that the men have been quote-unquote blind, remember stagnation and all of that, blinded to their situation. They need the entry of the masked other or something from the outside to allow them to see for the first time. Okay. The men, okay, we're on page 354 now. The men thought that the fuss was only womanish frivolity, okay? Okay? Fatigued because of the difficult nighttime inquiries, all they wanted was to get rid of the bother of the newcomer once and for all. All right? So those are the kind of lines, right? Just this idea, again, a burden. That's the key word, right? The other, the outside force, has become a burden. But you want to read between the lines, though, right? Well, why has he become a burden? Well, because he disrupts, right, their daily lives. Disrupts. Discontinuity. See the words that I'm trying to, right? So, again, don't try and do everything. You're going to simply pull out of the lecture the words that you think will work for an essay. Maybe quote from Foucault. I've got a couple of others that we'll talk about as well. All right? So, at the very end of page 354, right? Yeah, believe it or not, we're almost done with the story, okay? But this is crucial. At the bottom of 354, okay, one of the women, mortified by so much lack of care, then removed the handkerchief from the dead man's face, and the men were left breathless too. So, there's a couple of different ways I could have done this in the actual lecture notes, okay? So I'm going to go back to it here. Yeah. Go back to page 4 of the lecture notes just for a second, right? Just for a second. Yeah. This whole notion, okay? Actually, you don't have to go back to page 4, but there is this notion of concealing and revealing is very important, right? Okay, it's another aspect of an essay. Okay, another essay topic that you could deal with. Now, there is in the notes I have this whole idea um, of revelation. So think of the word. Okay, when you think of revelation, quite often we think of the Bible, but revelation literally means revealing. So in revealing, we finally see. Okay, you get it? You get the whole idea of what I'm trying to show you here? And this is an idea, it's a really interesting idea that goes back all the way to Greek philosophy. And Greek philosophy, so I will spell this word out for you, all right? The Greek word for truth, okay? So truth, Truth, is aletheia. A-L-E, okay, T-H, so aletheia. E-I, okay, A, aletheia. And aletheia simply means revealing. So there's another interesting concept here, this idea that the man, Esteban, okay, was covered in seaweed, okay? Then they cover his face. What I'm trying to show you here once again is this is a good way to get to the end of a paper. What is it that allows the men to finally see? Remember I just talked about Oedipus before. Well, this was huge in Greek thought. So the idea, right, to reveal means to see the light of day, to see the truth. And so what was a burden at one point for the men now becomes a revelation. You see what I'm trying to do there? It's a lot, I know. So again, don't try and do too much in your essay. But I think that's an interesting one, is it not? This whole notion of revealing, okay? We think it's a Christian thing. This notion of revelation, no, not at all. I could tell you the whole story of philosophy, as we go through the Dark Ages and then the church in the 11th and 12th centuries, how they get a hold of philosophy. We think that Aristotle and Plato, that we've lost their works, then all of a sudden they reappear. There's a whole history behind all of that. Just take my word for it, though. This idea that this notion of revealing, it's a very old concept, and it's not specific to Christianity at all, all right? And so, or Judaism, okay? It goes all the way back to the Greeks, and the idea, it's more of a revealing, okay, to see the light. And as I said, if you've read Oedipus the King, that's what the whole idea of light and darkness and sight and blindness, right? Tiresias and all of that, right? If you've read it, you know what I'm talking about. So I've given you lots of definitions there, but let me be very clear on something. Do not use the definitions that I have on this sheet, right? Go find your proper definitions as always, all right? Okay. And so I've also included the notion of I don't know why I included this, but there is the mention of Sir Walter Raleigh, and I only included that because every once in a while I'll get an email, why is that mentioned or whatever. There it is there. The whole idea that he was also looking for, he visited South America, was looking for El Dorado, like City of Gold and all of that. But don't worry about it. It doesn't really fit anything else. All right? Okay. And so, finally, and now we're on page 355. Like I said, we're almost done. They hold a splendid funeral for the dead body. So remember, this whole idea, it's a dead body, right? But the importance is that it was from the outside. It came from outside. It was something that was introduced into their lives. And ironically, even though it disrupted their lives, it allowed them to grow. That goes back to the whole idea of knowledge is not made for understanding, it's made for cutting, right? And again, it's kind of like your university career, is it not? Like if you're the exact same person and think the exact same way, okay, after 4 years of university, then what was the point? One would hope that you're going to learn a lot and grow a lot, and that's exactly what this story is all about. If I'm just going to keep it on a simplistic level for a moment, all right? And so, as we get near the end of the story, then, okay, they hold a splendid funeral. So, and this is interesting because if you do any work on Quetzalcoatl, this is exactly what happened in his story as well, right? That basically he shows up on shore and he basically transforms the villages and then goes back out to the sea. So there's a couple of ways of interpreting that, all right? But one way would be if you're going to keep with the religious aspect of your essay, well then it's kind of interesting how there's a kind of baptism going on at the end of the story, right? But ironically, even though it's Esteban who is sent out to sea, it's the people who are actually baptized, right? Right? They finally see and accept. Again, I'm not being very specific with that. I'm throwing an idea out there, but I think there's something you could do with that. Okay? All right. So, and again, like I said, we're going to have a template lecture in just a minute. Okay, so and we'll get some ideas going. I'll show you different things, all right? And I'll send you those notes as well, or you have them now. So we have a splendid funeral. At the final moment, it pained them to return him to the waters as an orphan. So some critics have said, but they have to let him go because then he can go on his journey and probably transform other villages, right? You don't have to mention that in your essay. I'm just saying that's basically the way the story works. So I'll give you an obvious quote now, one that most of you will probably use in your essays, and that's fine, right? The men and the women became aware for the first time of the desolation of their streets. I'm at the bottom of 355. The dryness of their courtyards, the narrowness of their dreams. Remember, imagination? The narrowness of their dreams as they faced the splendor and beauty of their drowned man. So, again, they needed an outside influence, someone to disrupt, okay? Again, like I'm just throwing ideas at you, to create a change in their own lives. And so, I'll go back to my notes here just for a moment, right? His mysterious appearance brings about the possibility, okay? Notice the words that I'm choosing now, possibility, for hope, potential, right? There's another interesting word you could use, right? They become aware of the narrowness of their dreams, fixed, remember, right? Okay, the notion of being fixed, stagnant, narrowness of their dreams. Dreams, of course, imagination. And then they send him out into the unknown. The word they use on top of 356 is the abyss, right? And so I don't think I want to do anything with that. Yes, I'm aware a lot of philosophy on the abyss, especially with someone who I think I've mentioned, Friedrich Nietzsche, but I don't think I want to do that here, right? Let's not get too complicated. Let's keep in mind it's a first-year course, right? Now, we're looking at your second paper, major paper, but again, I'm not asking you to go out and understand everything in the world of philosophy or whatever. Choose one thing. But let's look at the ending now of the story. All right? Okay. And so, at the very end of the story, okay, so I'm on the last page now. But they also knew that everything would be different from then on. Their houses would have wider doors, higher ceilings, etc., etc., etc. Okay? So in other words, now they have the ability to dream, okay, to imagine. I'm trying to pull things full circle now, that's all. But at the very end, Marquez gives us an image of a ship going by, okay, going by the peninsula on which they live, okay, and the captain would have to come down from the bridge in his dress uniform with his astrolabe, his pole star, and his row of war medals, and pointing to the promontory okay, of the roses on the horizon, okay, and then I'm just going to jump here. He would say that's Esteban's village. Okay, okay, so that's the end of the story. Now, a couple things we can do here, okay, because we're not done just yet. I'll try and be quick in the second part today, but I think this is important to wrap up because I'm going to give you about 2 or 3 more possibilities for essays. All right? Okay. And so, just trying to think how, in storytelling, the minute we see, okay, so we know that the village has been transformed, right? The roses and everything else. The captain of the ship looks to the horizon. Well, whenever you see in a movie, or if it's named in a story, this notion of the horizon is the place of possibility. You can see it, but you can never get to it. Right? Do you know what I mean? Right? Because obviously, the closer you get, the farther it moves away. Right? But it's symbolic. Right? It's significant. This idea, it's possibility. Okay, a game. So that becomes kind of important for the story. If you're talking about the notion of the imagination, maybe you could finish off your paper with the notion of the horizon. Do you know what I mean? It's the idea of always searching for more, right? That's kind of what Lacan is talking about when he deals with the notion of desire, right? Our desire is basically the thing that keeps us moving through life, is it not? Right? And so as I said, I'm almost about to wrap up, but there's one more major thing I want to do. But I want you to be careful for your final essay. In your first essay, okay, some of you tried to do way too much and ended up saying very little. So for your final essay, right, take an aspect and work it through. Maybe it's the notion of concealment and revealing. Maybe it's the notion of the imagination. And again, we're going to have a little workshop in a minute, all right? But there's so many different ways you can go about it. But don't try to do too much, because that's where then the paper just kind of loses focus and just starts talking about 1,000 different things with no actual central idea. Okay? So, and as I said, I don't mean to sound sexist, but I do think that for this paper, it works best if you simply deal with the men in the story. Now, that's not to say that you can't bring in the women or the children, right? Or obviously Esteban, right? But keep the men as the focus. I've been trying to show you that all along, okay? So, and again, whatever you do, do not set up your paper children, women, men. No, don't do that, because you'll end up repeating, and there'll be no development to the paper whatsoever. Okay, I've already hinted at things like that throughout the rest of the lectures, right? But watch out for that on the final paper, please. Okay, same thing will be true when we look at Rocking Horse Winter. Right? You don't want to deal with the mother, then the son, and then whatever. Right? No, don't do that. Take one character, keep that character, like we saw in Paul's case, keep that character as your focus, right? But then work through your ideas, right? And pull in other things. But as I said, but keep the focus on one main character. All right? Okay. So finally, and by the way, my notes are not great. Like when I send them to you, it's just to give you a kind of a sense of names and things like that. These are things, it's just ideas that I have that I work off of, right? So forgive me. I know they're not the greatest notes, but what can you do? All right. Anyway. And so finally, we go back then, we close off today with Foucault. Right? That's where that part on page 8 of my notes, that's still Foucault, same article. And he tells us the purpose of history, okay, is not to discover the roots of our identity. Now that's weird, isn't it? The purpose of history, okay, is not to discover the roots of our identity. In other words, if that's the way you look at history, the roots of your identity, all that does is reinforce the notion of tradition. And tradition, it can be a very dangerous thing. We're seeing it now in our lives, are we not? So Foucault is saying, no, it should commit itself to its dissipation. Because that root of our identity is a myth. It's a myth, right? Propagated by, like I don't even know if I need to say it anymore, right? But that history that we know, it's myth. It's all myth, right? And so to understand ourselves better, right? No, we need to get rid of all of that, right? And so, I'll just finish off, all right? Basically, what he's talking about at the very end of the essay is effective history once again. And as I said, we're living through it right now. It discovers the violence of a position that sides against those who are happy in their ignorance. Right? This idea that we know our history? No. We know like a tenth of history. Not even. Right? And so, against the effective illusions by which humanity protects itself. Again, that is exactly what's going on in the world today. People are afraid. They want to protect themselves, right? Right? By hanging on to their traditions. A position that encourages the dangers of research, in other words, finding out what really happened, and delights in disturbing discoveries, archaeology. That's it. That is exactly what this story is all about, right? So, maybe one last essay topic, okay? History versus archaeology, okay? Disturbance as effective history. You know what I mean? Something like that. We want our lives to be a continuous, lovely narrative. They're not. They're not. Well, you know yourself, okay? If I was to ask you, tell me about yourself, you would tell me where you were born, where you grew up, where you went to school. But that's not you, right? You're a million things, okay? And so that's kind of what Foucault is talking about, as well as many others, right? Concealment, revealing. And then it's really what the story is all about as well. And so to close off on the first part of the lecture today, ironically, how do we come to understand ourselves? We actually need those disturbing things from outside to disrupt, okay, what we think is a nice continuous narrative. That's growing. That's life. So if you hated this lecture, then you just grew. I'm kidding. Anyway. All right. So that'll be the part 1 today. And then, obviously I'll take a break, but then you'll have the notes on part 2. And I'll just do a couple of quick templates with you, just so you have a feel for, well, how would I go about doing my second essay? Okay? So like I said, I'll be right back. Okay? Thanks.